That trunk's had a long day.
You don't need to carry that.
I know.
You've been paying your dog a salary.
He guards the hen house. 1, 2, 3.
Stop counting.
I like you, June.
Cañon City sat where the Arkansas River cut through red sandstone, and in September of 1879, the town smelled like dust, river water, and the coal smoke drifting down from the canyon works. June Calloway stepped off the afternoon train with one trunk, one carpetbag, and a tin of shortbread she had baked 3 days earlier in Baltimore for a man who was supposed to be standing on this platform. He was not standing on this platform. She checked the small crowd twice. A few ranch hands loading crates. A woman selling apples from a cart. No sign of Elias Whitmore, who had written her every week for 2 years, describing the house he was building her. The porch, the well, the window that would catch the morning sun. She sat down on her trunk, the way a person sits when they have decided to wait, but haven't yet decided how long. The platform thinned out. The apple cart rolled away. The light went from gold to the particular orange that means evening, has made up its mind. She was still there when a man leading a horse, loaded with rope and feed sacks, slowed his steps, looked at her, looked at the trunk, and stopped. "That trunk's had a long day," he said. "About as long as you have, I'd guess." June looked up, startled into something close to a laugh despite herself. "It's held up better than I have. Trunks generally do." He tipped his hat. Mason called her. June Calloway. She glanced past him at the empty platform one more time, as if Elias might materialize out of the dust. He didn't. "I was supposed to be met. Folks usually are, when it works out." He said it plainly, not unkindly, the way a man states a fact about weather. "You got somewhere to stay tonight?" She did not. She said so because there was no version of pretending that would survive the question twice. "There's a boarding house on Elm Street, Larkspur House. Mrs. Whitby runs it, and she makes a decent supper." He picked up her trunk before she could object, hoisting it onto his shoulder with the unbothered ease of a man who did this kind of thing without making a production of it. "I'll walk you over. You don't need to carry that." "I know," he said, doing it anyway. She fell into step beside him, and for a block neither of them spoke. Then her stomach, betraying her completely, growled loud enough that Mason's mouth twitched. "I've got biscuits in my saddlebag," he offered. "Fair warning, they're my own cooking. My dog won't even beg for them." That's an honest advertisement. "I find honest advertisements get you further." He said it lightly, but something in his voice suggested he meant more by it than biscuits. And June, despite the ache sitting low in her chest, found herself almost smiling. Larkspur House turned out to be a tidy clapboard building with lace curtains and a landlady, Mrs. Constance Whitby, who asked exactly 4 questions before June had gotten both feet through the door. June answered with the fewest words that were still technically true. Mason set the trunk in the front hall, paid for the first week before June could reach for her coin purse, and was gone before she'd finished thanking him, leaving her standing in a stranger's hallway, 1,000 miles from anyone who knew her name. She did not sleep well. She lay listening to a town she didn't know, doing the arithmetic of her situation the way she'd done arithmetic her whole life, steadily, without panic, because panic never once balanced a ledger. In the morning, she walked to the station master's office and asked after Elias Whitmore. The station master, a narrow man named Pruitt, told her Whitmore had a claim north of town, that he'd been in a few weeks back, that he hadn't, to Pruitt's knowledge, come through yesterday. He said this while looking somewhere over her left shoulder, in the particular way of a man who knows more than he's offering. She thanked him and went looking for coffee, and found Mason Calder already at the counter of the sundown table, the only proper eatery in town, working through a plate of eggs like a man who ate on a schedule. "Sleep all right?" he asked, without looking up. "Wonderfully," she said, which was such an obvious lie that he actually laughed, a short, surprised sound, like he hadn't planned on it. "That's the worst lie I've heard all week, and I bought a horse off Otis Fenwick on Tuesday." "I'm told honesty gets you further," she said, and this time it was his turn to look startled, and then pleased, in a way he seemed to be trying not to show. The waitress, a sharp-eyed girl named Birdie, who had clearly already heard the whole story from someone, refilled June's coffee without being asked, and lingered a beat too long doing it. June wrapped both hands around the cup and let the warmth settle into her fingers. "I asked about Mr. Whitmore this morning," she said. The station master looked at the wall the whole time he answered. Mason set down his fork. "I'll ask around, if you want. You don't have to do that for a stranger." "I know," he said again, and June was beginning to understand that this was simply how the man agreed to things, not with promises, with, "I know," and then doing them anyway. She looked at him, this rancher who had carried her trunk, paid for her room, and was now offering, over eggs, to go find out what had happened to the man who was supposed to have married her, and felt the strange, off-balance sensation of being helped by someone who wanted nothing in return that she could yet identify. "Why?" she asked. He considered the question honestly, the way she was starting to notice he considered everything. "Because nobody else was going to," he said, and went back to his eggs, and June Calloway, who had traveled 1,000 miles to start a life that had not, so far, shown up to meet her, began to wonder if she'd gotten off the train in the right place after all, just not for the reason she'd packed her trunk. By the end of her second week at Larkspur House, June's travel money had thinned to almost nothing, and she'd applied the same careful arithmetic to her situation that she'd once applied to a Baltimore merchant's account books. The sum was not encouraging. No income, no family within 1,000 miles, no standing in this town, beyond a landlady, a waitress, and a rancher who kept turning up at exactly the moments she needed him, and never any moment past that. Mason came by Larkspur House on a Thursday, exactly a week after their breakfast, and found June in the front parlor, mending the hem of her only good dress, with the small, precise stitches of someone raised to make things last. "I've got a proposal," he said. "Strictly business." She set down her needle. "I'm listening. My accounts are a disaster. I can read a cow's temperament from 40 feet off, but I cannot make a column of numbers behave, and it's been costing me, for going on 3 years." He turned his hat once in his hands. She'd already clocked this as the thing he did when he was about to say something that cost him a little pride. "I can't pay much, but there's a spare room at the ranch, and meals that are better than what I fed you at breakfast. That's not a high bar." "No," he admitted. "It is not." She almost laughed. "The town will talk. Town's already talking. Might as well give them something to be wrong about." He paused. "At least this way, you'd have somewhere to be while they do it." June thought about her dwindling coin purse. She thought about the spare room, and meals better than disastrous, and a man who apparently could not lie convincingly even when it might have been useful to him. "I want to see the ledgers first," she said, "before I agree to anything." He looked faintly offended and faintly impressed. "You don't trust my word?" "I trusted a man's word all the way from Baltimore," she said, lightly enough that it didn't quite sting either of them. "I'd like to see the numbers this time." "Fair," he said, and he meant it, which she noticed. The ranch sat 12 miles north, along a road that climbed gently through scrub oak and grazing land, and June had not fully appreciated the distance until she was watching the town shrink behind Mason's wagon and understanding that 12 miles in Colorado meant something different than 12 miles in Baltimore. The house itself was plain and solidly built. A good stone hearth, a sturdy table, a bedroom, and a spare room stacked with saddle gear that smelled like leather and had clearly not been touched by anyone with an eye for order in some time. "I'll clear it out," Mason said, watching her survey the mess. "I'll do it," June said. "I'd like to see what I'm working with." She spent the afternoon clearing 3 years of a bachelor's accumulated clutter: a cracked harness, 4 mismatched cups, and, tucked behind a crate, a scruffy brown dog who thumped his tail against the floorboards and immediately claimed her lap as his own. "That's Biscuit," Mason said, appearing in the doorway. "He has no shame and terrible taste in company." "He has excellent taste," June said, scratching the dog's ears while Biscuit sighed with the contentment of an animal who had just found his new favorite person. They sat down to the ledgers that evening, and the ledgers were, as promised, a disaster. Not a ruinous one, the small, accumulating kind, the errors of a capable man who simply hated numbers and had been doing his honest best alone for 3 years. June found 4 instances where he'd undercharged for cattle, 2 where he'd been overcharged for feed and hadn't caught it, and 1 baffling entry where Biscuit appeared to have been logged as a working expense for 11 consecutive months. Mason. You've been paying your dog a salary." He looked over her shoulder at the entry, entirely unbothered. "He guards the hen house. He's asleep on my feet right now. He's off duty." Mason said it with such total seriousness that June laughed. The real kind, the kind that arrived before she'd decided to allow it. And Mason glanced at her sideways with an expression he seemed to be trying, not very successfully, to keep from turning into a grin. "He's an asset," she said, moving Biscuit's entry to the correct column. "Not a liability. There's a difference. Don't tell him that. He'll expect a raise." She looked around the little house, at the crooked shelf of mismatched cups, at the dog snoring against her boot, at this man frowning at a column of numbers like it had personally wronged him, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't expected to feel 12 miles outside a town she'd arrived in with nothing. Not comfort exactly. Comfort implied ease, and nothing about her situation was easy. But something that fit, the way a shoe fits before you've even noticed you were walking wrong in the old one. She didn't say any of that out loud. Some things needed proving out before they were worth saying. "I'll take the position," she said instead, and Mason nodded once, like a man closing a deal he'd been hoping would close, and went to go feed a dog who was, by June's calculations, already earning more than he deserved. The spare room became June's within a week, though she was careful, in her own mind, to keep calling it the spare room and not anything more permanent. She scrubbed the floor, hung her one good dress on a peg, and set her mother's small blue ribbon, tied around nothing now, since she'd stopped carrying Elias's letters in her pocket somewhere around day 4, on the dresser, where she could see it each morning. Mason kept a chipped blue teacup on the shelf above the stove that didn't match anything else in the house, and June noticed, over the course of several breakfasts, that he always reached for it first, out of habit, before catching himself and taking a plain tin mug instead. "Whose was that?" she finally asked, on a morning when the coffee was strong and the kitchen was warm, and Biscuit was underfoot, hoping for scraps he would not receive. "My mother's," Mason said, "only thing of hers that survived the move out here." He said it simply, without inviting further comment. the way he said most things that mattered to him. June reached up and took the cup down off the shelf and filled it with coffee and set it in front of him. "It's meant to be used," she said, "not kept behind glass like something already lost." He looked at the cup for a long moment. Then he looked at her, and something in his face went soft and a little unguarded, the way a man looks when someone has handed him back a piece of himself. He'd quietly stopped expecting anyone to notice. "Thank you," he said, and drank his coffee out of his mother's cup. And June went back to the ledgers, feeling absurdly, disproportionately pleased with herself over a teacup. She found other things that week, small evidence of a life kept together by a man with more patience for cattle than clutter. A shirt with a torn cuff hung over a chair, clearly meant to be mended someday and never gotten to. She mended it without being asked, the stitches small and even, and left it folded on his bed. He said nothing about it at supper, but she caught him, later, running his thumb along the repaired seam with the particular attention of a man checking that something good was actually real. "You didn't have to do that," he said finally. "I know," she said, borrowing his own words back at him, and he laughed, really laughed, head tipping back, and Biscuit, startled by the noise, barked once, and then looked deeply betrayed by his own reaction. There was an ease to the days that June hadn't expected to find so soon. 12 miles from a town where a man she'd crossed the country for had simply failed to appear. Mornings meant coffee and the ledgers. Afternoons meant Mason out with the cattle, and June scrubbing the accumulated dust of bachelor life out of every corner she could reach, humming under her breath in a way she hadn't done since before Baltimore, before the letters, before she'd let herself believe so completely in a man she'd never once seen in person. She thought about that, some evenings, sitting on the porch step with Biscuit's head heavy on her knee. She had believed Elias's letters the way she believed a ledger that balanced, carefully, and because the numbers, on the surface, had never once failed to add up. She still didn't know how a man could write 2 years of careful, specific letters, and not mean a single line of them. That part hadn't resolved itself yet, and she suspected it wouldn't for a while. But she noticed, too, that she thought about it less each day, and thought instead about whether Mason preferred his eggs before or after the coffee, and how Biscuit always chose her side of the bed to sleep against, and how a chipped blue teacup could hold more feeling than 2 years of pretty letters ever had. On the Saturday of her 3rd week, Mason came in from the north pasture, found her at the table, with the ledgers spread out, and Biscuit's expense column now labeled, in her careful hand, "Senior Household Staff, Unpaid, by Choice," and laughed so hard he had to sit down. "You've ruined my bookkeeping," he said, wiping his eyes. "I've corrected your bookkeeping," June said primly, though she was smiling too. "There's a difference." "There is not," he said, "but I'll allow it," and poured himself coffee in his mother's blue cup, and June thought, not for the first time, and not for the last, that she had come west, looking for a promise, and found, instead, something steadier, and a good deal more honest. October came in dry and gold, the cottonwoods along the river turning the color of old coins, and June had settled into Cañon City just enough to recognize faces at the general store, and be recognized in return, mostly with curiosity, occasionally with warmth, and once, memorably, with a plate of molasses cookies pressed into her hands by Mason's younger sister, Della, who had decided within 10 minutes of meeting June that she approved thoroughly and intended to say so often. "He never brings anyone out to the ranch," Della told her, in the unhurried way of someone settling in for a proper gossip. "Not once. You must be good at cards or ledgers or something." "Ledgers," June said. "Mostly ledgers." "Sure," Della said, entirely unconvinced, and went off smiling to herself. It was the postmistress, Opal Finch, who gave June the first real thread to pull. Mason had come into town for the ranch mail, June trailing along to post a letter to her mother, heavily edited, as her letters home had been for weeks now, trimmed of anything that would make Catherine Calloway worry more than she already did. "Whitmore," Opal said, sorting through envelopes with the unbothered efficiency of a woman who had done this 10,000 times. She glanced at June, not unkindly. "That's the name, isn't it? The one you came out for?" "That's the one," June said. Opal was quiet a moment, turning an envelope over in her hands like she was deciding something. "There was a letter through here, back in July, addressed east, to a lawyer's office in Baltimore, and the reply came back, marked from a Mrs. Margaret Ashford." She looked up. "I only remember because Ashford wrote urgent on the outside twice, and folks don't usually feel the need to say it more than once." June felt something in her chest go very still. Was Margaret Ashford family? A sister, perhaps? "Couldn't tell you," Opal said, "but I thought you should know it crossed my desk." Mason, standing beside June with the ranch mail under one arm, went quiet in a way she was learning to read, not sulking, but turning something over carefully before he spoke. "I'd like to look into it," he said, once they were back outside. "If that's all right with you. You don't have to fix this for me." "I know," he said. There it was again, that phrase that had become, between them, less an agreement and more a small vow. "I'd like to, anyway. You deserve to know the truth, whatever shape it turns out to have." He rode into town again 2 days later, this time to the Fremont County Land Office, where a narrow, ink-stained clerk named Otis Fenwick kept records of every claim and deed filed in the county, with the devotion of a man who found paperwork more trustworthy than people. Mason asked, plainly, whether a parcel had been filed under the name Elias Whitmore. Fenwick found it without much trouble. A modest claim north of the river, filed the previous spring, with a small house noted on the survey. He also found, 3 weeks back, a bill of sale. The parcel had changed hands. Whitmore had sold it. Sold it to who? Mason asked. "Cash buyer," Fenwick said, squinting at his own handwriting. "Fella from Pueblo. Paid quick. No haggling. That's usually a sign somebody needed the money faster than they needed the land." Mason rode the 12 miles home slow, turning the information over the way he turned his hat, and found June in the garden patch behind the house, pulling the last of the season's carrots with Biscuit supervising from a patch of sun. She looked up at his face and set down the trowel. "You found something." "I did." He crouched down across from her in the dirt, not standing over her, not softening it, just telling it to her straight, the way he told her everything. "He sold the land, the house he wrote you about. It's gone. Sold it 3 weeks ago, quick and quiet, for cash." June sat very still. Biscuit, sensing something in the air, pressed his head against her knee. "He sold our house," she said slowly, "and never told me he wasn't coming. Looks that way?" She was quiet a long moment, turning a carrot over in her hands, like it might offer an explanation the deed hadn't. "I want to write to this Mrs. Ashford," she said finally. "If she's his sister, she may know something Otis Fenwick's paperwork can't tell us." "That's a fair plan," Mason said. "It's not a plan," June said. "It's just the next honest thing to do." And she went inside to find paper and ink, with Biscuit trotting at her heels like a small, devoted escort, and Mason watching her go with an expression that had stopped, some weeks back, being merely admiration. The letter took 3 weeks to travel east, and the reply took nearly 4 to come back, and in the space between, Autumn finished its work on Cañon City. The cottonwoods went bare, the mornings turned sharp enough to fog the kitchen window, and June found herself, without quite deciding to, no longer counting the days since she'd arrived. She was, instead, counting other things. The eggs Mason inevitably burned when he tried to cook breakfast on the mornings she slept late. The number of times Biscuit stole a biscuit directly off the table when he thought no one was watching, which was often, since he was a terrible thief and an excellent liar about it afterward. The particular, specific quiet of the ranch at dusk, when the cattle settled and Mason came in from the fence line, smelling of cold air and horse, and the whole house seemed to exhale. Margaret Whitmore Ashford's reply arrived on a Tuesday, carried out from town by Opal Finch herself, which both June and Mason understood, from the fact of the postmistress making the 12-mile trip in person, meant its contents were significant. They sat at the kitchen table together while June opened it, Della having tactfully found a reason to be elsewhere that afternoon. Margaret wrote in a small, careful hand. She was Elias's older sister, and she was, she said plainly, deeply sorry. Their family, prosperous, proud, and precise about who belonged in it, had learned of Elias's engagement to a black woman from Baltimore and delivered an ultimatum: marry her and be cut off entirely, disowned from the family's business and its name, or end the arrangement and remain a Whitmore in good standing. He chose the money, Margaret wrote. I wish I could tell you he agonized over it. He did not agonize so much as flee. He sold the property he'd bought for you within the week, paid off a card debt he'd been hiding from all of us, and has not written to me since, which tells me plainly enough that he knows what he did. I am ashamed of my brother, Miss Calloway, and I am sorry that shame reached you across 1,000 miles of railroad track. You deserved better than a man who folded the moment it cost him something. June read it twice, then set it down very carefully, the way a person sets down something heavier than its weight would suggest. He sold our house to pay a card debt, she said, and let his family's opinion decide the rest. Looks that way, Mason said again, and this time he reached across the table, not grasping her hand, just resting his own near it, close enough that she could close the distance if she wanted, which after a moment she did. I keep waiting to feel something bigger than I do, June admitted. Angrier, sadder, I don't know. Instead, I mostly feel tired of having believed him so completely. You believed a story that was well told, Mason said. That's not foolishness. That's just what happens when somebody lies. Well. He turned his mug, the plain tin one, not the blue cup, which June noted he still reserved for himself alone, between his palms. For what it's worth, I don't think less of you for any of it. I know, June said, and smiled despite everything, because it was, undeniably, his phrase, handed back to him again. He caught the echo and huffed something that was almost a laugh. I deserved that. You did. They sat together while the kitchen went dim around them, neither of them in a hurry to light the lamp, and June found, somewhat to her own surprise, that grief, when it finally arrived properly that evening, arrived smaller than she'd feared, cushioned on all sides by a warm kitchen, a sleeping dog, and a man who had not once asked her to hurry through any part of it. By November, June had become, without any formal ceremony, a fixture of the ranch, and something close to a fixture of the town. Mrs. Whitby waved to her from the boarding house porch. Bertie saved her the good end of the pie, without being asked. Della had taken to calling her sister, as a joke, that both of them understood was not entirely a joke. The Ledgers, meanwhile, had gone from disaster to merely untidy, which June considered a personal triumph, and Mason had started, very quietly, asking her opinion on things that had nothing to do with numbers, which cattle to sell in spring, whether to fix the east fence or the barn roof first, whether Biscuit's begging habit had crossed from charming into unbearable. Charming, Mason said, and Biscuit, sensing he was the topic of debate, wagged so hard he knocked over a chair. It was on a cold Tuesday morning, both of them reaching for the sugar tin at the same moment, that their hands landed on top of each other, his broad and weathered, hers smaller and ink-stained from the ledgers, and neither of them moved for a beat too long to pretend it was nothing. "You're in my sugar," Mason said, which was, June reflected later, possibly the least romantic sentence ever spoken by a man in the grip of something. But he hadn't pulled his hand away either. "I was here first," she said, not moving hers. Debatable. Not really. Neither of them was talking about the sugar anymore, and both of them knew it, and the kitchen held very still around the two of them until Biscuit, with the timing of a dog who had decided he'd had quite enough of human nonsense, shoved his nose between their hands, demanding to know why breakfast was taking so long. They both laughed, startled and a little relieved, and the moment scattered into ordinary morning again. Coffee poured, eggs only slightly burned, Biscuit rewarded with a piece of toast he absolutely had not earned. But something had shifted, and June caught herself, over the following days, noticing things she hadn't let herself notice before. The way Mason's face changed when he thought no one was watching him watch her. The care he took setting his mother's blue cup in front of her. Once, without a word, the morning she'd had a difficult letter from home. The fact that he had started, without ever announcing it, walking the fence line, a little closer to the house, on the evenings she sat on the porch, as though he simply preferred to be within sight of her. She mentioned none of this to Della, who would have made an entire production of it, but Della noticed anyway, because Della noticed everything. "You're both hopeless," Della informed her cheerfully, helping June pin up laundry on a bright, cold afternoon. "He's been mooning around here for a month, like a boy who's never spoken to a girl in his life, and you go pink every time he says your name. It's honestly a little embarrassing to watch." "I don't go pink. You're pink. Right now. That's the wind." "It is a windless day, June." June threw a wet stocking at her, and Della caught it, laughing, and the two of them dissolved into the kind of giggling that had nothing at all to do with laundry, while Biscuit barked at both of them from the porch, as though personally scandalized by the noise. That evening, over supper, Mason cleared his throat twice before managing to say, "Della thinks I ought to take you to the harvest dance next month." "Does she?" "She's not wrong, generally, about these things." He was looking at his plate very intently. "If you wanted to go with me, as company." June considered making him suffer a little longer, decided against it, and said, "I'd like that," and watched the tips of his ears go faintly red, which she found so unexpectedly endearing that she had to look down at her own plate to keep from grinning outright. "Good," Mason said, to his eggs, and Biscuit, sensing victory in the air for reasons known only to himself, thumped his tail against the floor. The Cañon City harvest dance filled the Methodist chapel hall with fiddle music, warm cider, and the particular electricity of a small town, given a legitimate excuse to gossip in one room all at once. June wore her one good dress, brushed and pressed within an inch of its life, and walked in on Mason's arm to a room that went quiet for exactly 3 seconds before deciding, with the practical good sense of frontier people, to go right back to being a party. Della hugged her within the first minute. Reverend Amos Whitlock shook Mason's hand with the look of a man revising several opinions in real time, and Everett Pruitt, the banker's son, young, handsome, and thoroughly aware of both facts, appeared at June's elbow with a smile so polished it practically caught the lamplight, "Miss Calloway," he said, "I don't believe we've had the pleasure." They had not. He remedied this with 10 minutes of practiced charm and an invitation to dance that June accepted, mostly because refusing would have been unkind, and partly, she admitted privately, because she wanted to see what Mason would do about it. What Mason did was stop mid-sentence in a conversation with the Pruitt boy's own father and watch her circle the floor with an expression that had absolutely nothing to do with the weather or the cattle prices he'd been discussing 30 seconds earlier. The song ended. Everett said something else charming that June barely registered. She thanked him and walked straight back to Mason. "Dance with me," she said. "I'm terrible at it." "I know. I mean genuinely terrible. I count out loud sometimes." "I know that too," June said. "I don't care." He led her onto the floor, and he was, as promised, genuinely terrible. Too careful, too deliberate, muttering numbers under his breath that were absolutely not keeping time with the fiddle. "You're counting," she said. "I'm concentrating." Same thing, apparently. "It is not the same thing, June. It is exactly the same thing." She looked up at him, close enough now that the rest of the hall had gone soft and unimportant around the edges. "Stop counting." He looked down at her for a long moment. Then, very deliberately, he stopped. They finished the dance in something that could no longer generously be called dancing, more a slow, off-rhythm sway that neither of them seemed inclined to correct, while Everett Pruitt watched from across the room with the baffled expression of a man who had lost a contest he hadn't realized he was entered in, and Della, catching June's eye over Mason's shoulder, mouthed, "I told you so," with such delight that June had to bite back a laugh. "I'm still terrible at this," Mason murmured, close to her ear. "You're improving," June said, which was a lie, and they both knew it, and neither of them cared even a little. Later, on the ride home under a sky thick with stars neither of them had grown up with, Mason pulled the wagon to an easy stop where the road crested a low rise and the whole valley opened out below them, lamplight scattered across the dark like something spilled and precious. "I wasn't going to say anything tonight," Mason said, looking straight ahead at the horses. "Didn't seem like the kind of thing you say at a dance, with Everett Pruitt hovering around like a mosquito. That's a very ungenerous comparison to Everett." "It's an accurate one." He finally looked at her. "I like you, June Calloway. I've liked you since somewhere around the sugar tin, if I'm honest. And probably since before that, if I'm being fully honest. Which I understand is a habit of mine you're stuck with now." June felt something warm rise up through her chest, unhurried and entirely certain. "That's the least terrible thing you've ever said to me." High praise. "I'll allow it," she said, echoing him, and when he leaned down, slow and careful, giving her every reasonable chance to lean away, she didn't take it. She met him halfway instead, under a sky full of unfamiliar stars, with Biscuit, back at the ranch, almost certainly asleep and blissfully unaware of the whole affair. December arrived with the first real snow, and the ranch settled into the particular hush that comes over a house when the whole world outside has gone soft and white and quiet. June had, somewhere in the last 2 months, stopped thinking of the spare room as temporary, though she still hadn't said so out loud, and Mason had taken to finding small, unnecessary reasons to be near the house instead of out with the herd, mending a gate that wasn't broken, restacking wood that was already stacked fine. It was Della who finally said the thing neither June nor Mason seemed willing to say plainly. "You're going to marry him," she announced, dropping into a kitchen chair with the confidence of a much older sibling, though she was in fact younger than both of them. "You know that, don't you? Everyone in town knows it. Reverend Whitlock's already asked me twice when to expect the banns." Della. I'm only saying what's obvious, June. Della helped herself to a molasses cookie off the cooling rack without asking, which June had also come to understand was simply how Della operated. He built you an extra shelf in the kitchen last week, for no reason anybody could name. My brother does not build unnecessary shelves for house guests. June, despite herself, laughed. It's a very good shelf. It's a declaration of intent is what it is. That evening, snow falling steady outside the kitchen window, June told Mason about the letter that had arrived that morning from her mother. Gentler than the last, but still asking, still hoping. Won't you come home for a visit, at least, so I know for certain that you're well? You should go, Mason said, reading over her shoulder. See your mother. Let her see you're all right. I know I should. June folded the letter carefully. I keep thinking about how to tell her what's happened here without it sounding like... She stopped, searching for the honest word. Without it sounding smaller than it is. What is it exactly? Mason asked, quiet, watching her with the particular attention he gave to things that mattered. June looked at him for a long moment. At this man who had carried her trunk before he knew her name, who kept his mother's chipped cup in daily use instead of behind glass, who counted out loud when he danced and built unnecessary shelves and had never once, in 3 months, told her anything he didn't fully mean. It's not small, she said finally. I'd like her to know that. Then tell her that. I will. She hesitated, then added, lighter, because the moment had gone soft enough that she wanted to laugh before she cried. I might leave out the part about the shelf, though. Della's already convinced the whole town we're engaged over a piece of pine. Mason's ears went faintly red again, a thing she had come to treasure noticing. Della talks too much. Della is not wrong, historically, about very much. He didn't answer that directly, but he reached over and took her hand across the table, turning it over gently, to look at her ink-stained fingers, the same careful attention he gave to a torn cuff or a chipped cup, things worth mending, worth keeping. Write your mother, he said. Tell her you're well. Tell her you're... He paused, choosing the word with visible care. Tell her you're settled, if that's true. It's true, June said, and meant it completely. And outside the window, the snow kept falling, quiet and steady, covering the whole valley in something clean and new. January brought bitter cold, and the kind of closeness that comes from two people keeping a house warm together through a hard winter. June wrote her mother a long letter, the honest kind this time, unedited, describing the ranch, the ledgers, Biscuit's ongoing theft of household baked goods, and, carefully, near the end, a man named Mason Calder, who she did not describe in detail, but who she suspected her mother would understand plenty about anyway. Her mother's reply came back faster than usual, and shorter, and considerably warmer than June had expected. Bring him to Baltimore when the weather allows, Catherine Calloway wrote. I find I would like very much to meet the man my daughter can't stop mentioning, even when she is clearly trying not to mention him at all. June read that line to Mason at the kitchen table, and he went very still in the particular way he did when something had struck him harder than he wanted to admit. Your mother wants to meet me. She does. I've never been past Denver. There's a first time for most things, June said, and Mason looked at her for a long moment, and then out the window at the fence line, dusted white with frost, and seemed to be working through something privately before he spoke again. Come walk with me, he said, before it gets full dark. They bundled against the cold and walked the fence line together, Biscuit bounding ahead through the snow with the delighted abandon of a dog who had never once considered that winter might be unpleasant. Mason was quiet for most of the walk, turning something over, and June had learned by now not to rush him through his own silences. At the far corner of the pasture, where the fence met the old cottonwood and the whole white valley spread out below them, he finally stopped. "I'm not good with speeches," he said. "I never have been. I count out loud when I dance, and I once tried to write you a letter of my own, back before the dance, and I burned it in the stove because it sounded like something out of a bad novel." June laughed, startled. "You wrote me a letter?" "3 of them. All terrible." He shook his head, half embarrassed, half fond of his own foolishness. "So I'm not going to try that again. I'm just going to say it plain, the way I say most things." He took her gloved hand in both of his. "I would like it very much, June Calloway, if the house I'm building a shelf onto, one improvement at a time, like a man with a very obvious plan, was one you meant to stay in, permanently, as my wife, if you'll have me." June's breath caught, visible in the cold air between them, and for one long moment she simply looked at him, snow catching in his hair, Biscuit sitting patiently in the drift beside them, as though he too were waiting on her answer, the whole quiet valley holding still around the question. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." "Obviously," Mason repeated, and the word came out on something that was almost a laugh and almost something closer to relief, and he pulled a small ring from his coat pocket, plain silver, a little worn, clearly something that had waited in a drawer for exactly this moment. "It was my mother's," he said, sliding it onto her finger with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Same as the cup." "I know how to treat things that were your mother's," June said softly. "I'll treat this the same way, used, loved, not kept behind glass." Mason didn't trust himself to answer that in words, so he didn't try. He simply kissed her instead, snow falling lightly around them both, Biscuit barking once, in what could only be interpreted as enthusiastic approval, and June Calloway, who had crossed 1,000 miles chasing one man's promise, and found, instead, a rancher who kept his in the smallest and steadiest ways possible, understood that she had finally, completely, arrived exactly where she was supposed to be. They traveled to Baltimore in March, when the passes were clear enough for the trains to run reliably, and June stood on the platform at Cañon City, with a return ticket in her gloved hand, and felt the strange, good vertigo of a story, circling back to where it started, and meaning something entirely different this time. "Louder than I expected," Mason admitted, as the train pulled out, gripping the seat arm like a man determined not to make a scene about it. "You get used to it. I'll take your word for it." He did get used to it, mostly, somewhere around Kansas, and by the time the flat plains gave way to the rolling green of the east, he'd relaxed enough to talk for hours, about his father, who'd come out from Ohio and broken this land through sheer stubbornness, about the 3 years he'd spent alone on the ranch before June arrived, years he admitted, now, had been lonelier than he'd ever said aloud to anyone. June's mother met them at the door on Fenwick Street, with an expression that suggested she had been rehearsing composure all morning, and was finding the rehearsal only partly successful. She looked at June. She looked at Mason. She looked, very deliberately, at June's left hand. "Well," Catherine Calloway said, "come in, there's coffee." Mason took off his hat before he'd even crossed the threshold. "Mrs. Calloway, thank you for having me. June's told me a great deal about you." "She's told me almost nothing about you," Catherine said, "which I've come to understand means it's serious." She looked him over once. Frankly, the way a woman appraises something she intends to keep. "You're the one with the dog. Biscuit sends his regards. He'd have come himself, but he's terrible on trains." Catherine's mouth twitched despite herself, and June, watching from just behind Mason's shoulder, felt something in her chest unknot completely, for the first time since she'd boarded a westbound train alone, months ago, believing a different man's promises entirely. The week in Baltimore passed warm and easy. June's mother pulled her into the kitchen on the second night and asked, without preamble, "Does he make you laugh?" Constantly, usually without meaning to. "That's the right answer," Catherine said, satisfied, and poured them both more coffee, and June told her, at long last and in full, everything. The empty platform, the terrible ledgers, the blue teacup, the shelf built for no reason anyone would admit to, the counting at the dance, the ring that had been his mother's. Catherine listened to all of it with the particular stillness of a woman recognizing, in her daughter's voice, a happiness she hadn't dared hope for after that first, terrible letter about a man who never showed up at all. They boarded the westbound train the following Sunday. June's whole family gathered on the platform to see them off, her mother pressing a small parcel of Baltimore coffee into Mason's hands. "For the ranch, so you remember where she came from." And June understood, watching the city recede through the window, that she was not leaving anything behind, so much as carrying two homes forward together. Somewhere past the Mississippi, Mason reached over and took her hand, turning it so the ring caught the afternoon light. "Any regrets?" he asked, half teasing. "One," June said, straight-faced. "I never did get to see what you'd have written in those 3 terrible letters." "Absolutely not," Mason said, with real alarm. "Those stay burned. I'll get it out of you eventually. You will not." "I already got a shelf out of you without even trying," June pointed out. "I have excellent methods." Mason laughed. The full, unguarded kind that still, months in, surprised him a little every time it happened, and pulled her hand up to press a kiss against her knuckles, right over his mother's ring, and June rested her head against his shoulder and watched Colorado come up slowly to meet them, gold light spreading over land that had, without her ever quite planning it, become entirely and permanently hers. She had crossed 1,000 miles once, chasing a promise made of pretty words. She went home now, to something plainer and considerably sturdier. A chipped blue cup used every morning instead of kept behind glass. A dog with no shame and excellent instincts. A shelf, built for no good reason, except that someone had wanted a reason to be near her, and a man who had never once needed 3 tries at a letter to prove that he meant, plainly and completely, every single thing he said.